Frank Dorsey was almost finished locking up the diner when the storm broke. Rain hammered the tin awning, dripping in uneven streams onto the pavement. The neon sign buzzed overhead, half the letters flickering, casting the alley in a sickly red glow. He tugged his coat tighter, bone-tired after a 16-hour shift. All he wanted was silence, his old recliner, and a few hours of dreamless sleep. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind, a thin, broken whistle between the buildings. But then came a sound no storm could make, a sharp, trembling cry. Frank froze, hand on the deadbolt. His heart gave a thud he hadn't felt in years. The sound came again, urgent, fragile, almost swallowed by the rain. He turned, flashlight beam cutting through sheets of water, and followed it down the alley. The cry led him to the dumpster. Rusted hinges groaned as he pushed the lid open. Inside, among plastic bags and crushed boxes, lay a small bundle. His light caught the face, red, wet, scrunched tight against the cold. Tiny fists waved weakly in the air. A baby. Frank staggered back a step, the beam shaking in his hand. He was 60 years old, worn thin by debt and solitude. His wife long gone, his son buried in a war no one mentioned anymore. He could barely keep the diner alive. And yet, walking away was unthinkable. He reached in, lifted the child out. The blanket was soaked through, heavy with rain and grease. The baby shivered, mouth open in a voiceless sob. Frank stripped off his flannel coat, wrapped it around the little body, and held the child against his chest. "Easy now," he muttered, voice breaking. "You're safe." Headlights flashed at the far end of the alley. A sleek black car idled there, silent except for the low hum of its engine. Through the rain-blurred windshield, Frank thought he saw a figure inside, watching. He squinted, but before he could step closer, the car slid away into the night. Back in the diner, Frank laid the baby on the counter beneath the flickering neon. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, dialing the sheriff with fingers that barely obeyed. The child's cries filled the empty booths, a sound both terrifying and alive. Frank didn't know who had left the baby there. He didn't know why that car had been waiting in the dark. But as he rocked the child against his chest, one thought pressed harder than the storm outside. This night wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. 2 decades slid past like rain down glass, yet the memory of that night clung to Frank. He kept the diner alive on little more than habit, serving pancakes to truckers and black coffee to night shift cops. His joints stiffened, his hair thinned, but people still came. Not for the food, it was ordinary, but for him. Word had spread long ago about the baby in the dumpster. Nobody spoke of it openly, but they remembered. Rough men in leather jackets who once intimidated the town treated Frank with a quiet respect. Long-haul drivers left tips that doubled their meals. When storms cut the power, neighbors came with lanterns. It wasn't charity. It was the return of something he had given without thought. On a night much like the one when it all began, another storm rolled in. Lightning painted the sky over the highway, and rain slapped against the diner windows in sharp bursts. Frank moved slower now, every step measured, his back bent. He had just poured a mug of coffee for himself when the door opened. The man who stepped in didn't belong. He wore a charcoal suit, sharp lines cutting against the shabby booths and grease-stained floor. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar tracing the edge of his jaw. He looked like he had stepped out of a different world entirely. Frank wiped his hands on his apron. "Kitchen's closing," he said, voice gravelly. The man didn't sit. He studied Frank, eyes dark and steady, like he'd been rehearsing this moment. Finally he spoke. "You don't recognize me," Frank frowned. "Should I?" The man placed a leather briefcase on the counter, clicked it open. Inside were documents, a stack of checks, and deeds Frank couldn't begin to understand. Then he said, voice low but certain, "You found me in a dumpster." 20 years ago, Frank's throat closed. The rain outside seemed to hush, leaving only the buzz of neon. His mind shot back to that night. The cries, the blanket, the black car at the edge of the alley. "You're that baby?" His words came out broken, disbelieving. The man nodded. "My name is David now. You gave me a life. Tonight I give something back." Frank stared at the fortune laid across the counter, at the stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. His knees weakened, but he held onto the counter's edge. He had never asked for thanks, never expected to see the baby again. Yet here he was, grown, powerful, and carrying a truth that would upend everything Frank thought was buried in the past. The diner felt smaller with David sitting there, his presence too large for the dim booths and scuffed linoleum. The storm pressed against the windows, thunder rumbling low like a warning. Frank poured them both coffee, his hands still unsteady. David pushed a folded paper across the counter. "I've been carrying this for years," he said. Frank opened it carefully. An old photograph, edges curled, the color nearly gone. It showed the alley behind the diner, rain-slick asphalt glimmering under a street lamp. In the corner, barely visible, was a black car, headlights dimmed. Frank's stomach dropped. He leaned closer, fingers tightening around the photo. "I saw that car the night I found you," he whispered. David's gaze didn't waver. "So did I, though I was too small to remember." This picture surfaced in a box of evidence someone tried to throw out. A custodian passed it to me. No record, no official file. Just this. He tapped the blurred timestamp at the bottom. October 3rd, 1981. The night you saved me. Frank felt the weight of years pressing down. He remembered standing there, rain dripping from his coat, the baby bundled in his arms. The car had idled just long enough for him to know it wasn't chance. Whoever had left the child had wanted him gone, yet stayed close enough to watch. "Do you know whose car it was?" Frank asked, his voice rough. David exhaled slowly. "I've studied it. It's a Lincoln Town car. Not many owned one back then, and only one man in this town kept his polished black, always parked in the same place on Main Street." He paused. "Sheriff Tom Greer." Frank blinked, disbelief warring with memory. Sheriff Greer, trusted, admired, a man whose word shaped the town. The very one who had arrived first that night, patting Frank's shoulder, assuring him the baby would be looked after. "I trusted him," Frank muttered, anger breaking through. "I let him take you away." David's jaw tightened. "And he made sure the case went nowhere. Records sealed, witnesses dismissed. For years I thought I was abandoned by a stranger. Now I know someone with power made that choice." The rain lashed harder, rattling the glass. Frank stared at the photo again, the grainy outline of the car glaring back at him. All those years he had buried the memory, convincing himself it was too late to ask questions. But the truth had a way of circling back. He set the photo down carefully, as if it were an explosive. "If you're right, son," he said softly, "then this town's been living under a lie for 20 years. David's eyes held his. "That's why I came back. To finish what you started." By morning, the diner buzzed with more than the sizzle of bacon. Word had seeped through town like coffee through a cracked filter. Folks came not just for breakfast, but to whisper, to glimpse the tall stranger who claimed to be the dumpster baby grown. Frank felt their eyes flicking between him and David, between past and present, as if trying to stitch the story together themselves. David wasted no time. He filed requests for records at town hall, pressed the sheriff's office for old reports. Each time he was turned away, doors closing fast, answers clipped, files misplaced, nothing to see. That case is long gone. It was too neat, too rehearsed. But the town had a long memory, and Frank had earned its quiet loyalty. That night, a group of truckers filled the booths, their rigs parked nose to tail outside like a steel barricade. Later, bikers rolled in, their engines echoing down Main Street, leather dripping from the rain. To outsiders, they looked menacing, but inside they ordered pie, their presence a clear message. Frank wasn't standing alone. The showdown came the following evening. Sheriff Tom Greer himself walked through the diner door, uniform crisp, badge gleaming as though polished for the occasion. His once dark hair had thinned, his shoulders stooped, but his voice still carried authority. "Enough of this nonsense," Greer said, scanning the crowded room. "Rumors, photographs, wild accusations. It ends here." David stood, the photo already on the counter between them. "You were there the night I was left to die," he said, his tone steady but edged with steel. "Your car, your shadow in the alley." "Why?" The diner went silent. Even the neon seemed to dim. Frank rose too, slower but with weight. "Tom," he said, voice low but clear, "I saw your Lincoln idling that night. I buried the memory because I trusted you. I shouldn't have." Murmurs rippled through the room. People exchanged looks, stories they had dismissed suddenly clicking into place. Greer's face flushed. "I was a young deputy then. I had orders." "You don't know the pressures." "Orders from who?" David cut in. Greer faltered. His jaw clenched, eyes darting to the crowd, the bikers glaring, the truckers stiff, townsfolk leaning forward. The mask he had worn for decades was slipping, cracks spreading under the weight of witness. "Don't hide behind excuses," Frank said, his old hands trembling but his gaze sharp. "You left a child to die. You buried the truth." The sheriff's lips pressed tight. For the first time, his authority didn't hold. The community wasn't looking at a protector anymore. They were looking at a man cornered by his own lies, and in that silence, it was clear. The reckoning had finally come. The trial lasted through the fall. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, cameras flashing as Sheriff Tom Greer, once untouchable, walked in shackled, his polished badge stripped from his chest. The town he had ruled with quiet control now whispered his name with shame. Witnesses came forward, deputies who remembered files going missing, clerks who recalled evidence boxes suddenly reassigned, neighbors who had seen the Lincoln idling near Frank's diner that night, but never dared to speak. Frank sat through every hearing, shoulders bent but eyes sharp. David was beside him, the photograph pinned like an anchor to the case. What began as a faded image had cracked open a truth too heavy to bury anymore. The verdict was guilty. Not just of negligence, but of obstruction, years of deceit tied to a baby left in the dark. When the gavel fell, a hush swept through the courtroom. Justice had arrived decades late, but it had arrived. Life after was quieter, but different. David refused to let his fortune vanish into faceless accounts. He renovated Frank's crumbling diner, adding bright windows and new booths, while keeping the neon sign that had flickered through his childhood absence. More than that, he started a foundation, scholarships, shelters, community programs, all stamped with a single phrase: kindness compounds. Frank never took a dime for himself. He worked the counter until his knees gave out, content to pour coffee and watch strangers become neighbors in his booths. What filled him wasn't money, but the sight of a town that had rallied when truth mattered, and a boy he once lifted from trash now standing taller than anyone could have dreamed. On the diner's reopening night, the place overflowed. Truckers parked along the highway, bikers lined their motorcycles in rows, families packed the booths. Laughter and clinking silverware replaced years of silence. At the counter, Frank sat with David, who leaned close and said, "You gave me life when no one else would. Now it's my turn to give it back." Rain began to fall outside, soft this time, tapping against the glass. Frank listened, no longer hearing menace in the sound. He looked at David, once an abandoned child, now a man carrying a town forward, and allowed himself a rare smile. For the first time in decades, the weight of that stormy night lifted. Compassion, he realized, had never been wasted. It had only grown, circling back with a force greater than he ever imagined, and under the steady hum of neon, Frank finally believed in something he thought was lost, that kindness could outlast even the darkest lies.